Hey everyone, welcome to Resilience Unravelled. This podcast is a result of my fascination with subjects like resilience, accountability, burnout, life fulfillment and other life and work-based performance issues, as well as many of the other obsessions I bump into in my life. I spend my time working with highly successful teams, people and organisations, and this podcast introduces their remarkable stories and expertise, as well as my own synthesis of the key issues, strategies, tips, tools and resources to thrive in life. If you find this podcast useful, why not go over to our site qedod.com. If you'd like some resources on how to manage and beat burnout, head to qedod.com/burnout2019 for some goodies. Stay tuned to the end to find out details of how to order a free ebook. Enjoy the podcast. And so today I'm talking to Lydia Denworth, an author, journalist and speaker based in the US, as I'm sure you're going to realise pretty well straight away. So it's, what time is it here? It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Hello, Lydia.
Hello. It's lovely to talk to you.
And what time of the day is it where you are?
It is 10 a.m. in New York City.
I can sense a song coming on.
I'm not very good at singing, so no.
Seriously? Oh, and I was looking forward to. I thought we were talking about singing today. Songs from Broadway.
Alas, no.
Oh, well, good. Well, what we are going to be talking about today are some of your work, and which is absolutely fascinating. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and sort of your story?
Okay, I am a science journalist and author, and I have written 3 books of popular science, and I'm a contributing editor at Scientific American here in the U.S., and then I write for a lot of other publications. And I guess we can talk about, maybe we talk about the books. I'm not sure how much you want me to talk about all the books right now, but the ones that are most relevant to this conversation is that one is called I Can Hear You Whisper, and it's the story of my youngest son who is deaf and has a cochlear implant and a hearing aid. And it's all about my journey as his mother to figure out how to help him. And then, of course, since I'm a science writer, I investigated how the brain processes sound and language and what it was going to mean for him. And then I have another book coming out next year called Friendship, The Evolution, Biology, and Extraordinary Power of Life's Fundamental Bond.
Fantastic. So, wow, so much to talk about already. Let's start about this description of yourself as a popular scientist. What does that mean?
Popular science writer is what I mean. It just means that I write serious science, but for a lay audience. You know, right. I'm not a scientist. In fact, the irony is that I was a history major. I took this as little science as was possible back in the day, but then I had a bit of a career shift mid-career, and I got really interested in telling the stories of science. And I find that science is a story. The whole scientific process is a story of exploring ideas and testing them and seeing where they lead. And I find it really interesting and really important. And then, lo and behold, when my son turned out to have a hearing loss, I kind of found myself at the front lines of a scientific story in my own life. So that's kind of...
So, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because you, in a way, you have quite an important role at the moment, because there's a sort of anti-science theme running through some parts of the world at the moment, isn't there? You know, yes, feelings are more important than facts.
Which, right. Feelings are great, but feelings are based in physiology and biology, exactly. To be totally honest, right? And fact, we can't, you don't get to make the facts.
I think there's something in the zeitgeist at the moment, isn't it? That somehow has created this idea that we shouldn't think about experts. Maybe there's an anti-expert drive, and I think your thing about being someone who can translate for people who are not scientists some of the big ideas, because actually I think sometimes the scientific community doesn't help itself because they wrap themselves in jargon, don't they? And it makes it difficult for non-scientists to understand.
No, that's very true. And I do see that exactly as my job as a translator and as something of a storyteller, as I said. But I also think that one of the issues is that, science is actually, it is a process and it's always changing. We're always learning more. And sometimes that changes what we knew before. But it does make it's not a neat and tidy process where one day you wake up and say, this is the truth. There's a lot of uncertainty, and to some extent that's by design. And so, but we move over time to really understanding more and to getting consensus. And so, for instance, on climate change today, 99% of scientists, there is absolute consensus that the climate is changing and that it is that human beings are part of the problem, are the problem. But people are able to. There are a lot of ways of kind of tweaking what you find when you do a study and of, resisting what you don't want to be true, calling it junk science when it isn't. And in fact, my first book, which I didn't mention, was about environmental science, and it was a dual biography of a scientist and a doctor who were among the first to understand that lead, the metal, was as harmful as it was. And this was back in the 60s and 70s. And the story is really about the evolution of knowledge, of beginning to understand how things come out into, in this case, how a toxin can come out into the world and make people sick. And and science moved on that subject over time. And, so people want certainty. They want easy answers. They don't like complexity. Sometimes science doesn't match up with that so much.
And it's fascinating, isn't it? Because I think sometimes we often presume that science is about a battle between economics and money. But sometimes science, as you say, is about knowledge. It's about figuring out that plastic was a wonderful thing until we actually realised that there was so much. We're finding it in places it was not meant to be. And the same with lead. And there's nothing the matter with lead per se, but it's when it begins to appear in the wrong places or be used for the wrong things. And I'm fascinated to hear more about the lead thing, because the book's called Toxic Truth, I believe. And,
yes, exactly.
So tell me a bit more about that, because I think actually, we in this country we've had a big debate about lead and its effect on from cars and such like, and the way it's been banned from cars and emissions have been banned from being near schools and such like. But tell me about how that worked out over in the US.
Oh, it was a drama. It was really, there was a big fight. Basically, there was a fight between science and industry, but I do think what it was really about, it's a case study for how we assess risk, how we think about it. It's a case study for how we're now handling climate change or not. It is this what happened. I guess the short version is that what happened here is that first. Scientists, and the one that I feature in my book is a geochemist named Claire Patterson, and he was at Caltech, and he was working on figuring out the age of the Earth, actually dating the age of the Earth. And I don't have time to go into all the details, but it's fascinating about how he came to understand. He was using lead isotopes to do that. Uranium decays into lead, and he was measuring this, and there was so much more lead than there should have been. And basically what he figured out was that lead was everywhere in the atmosphere, and that it was contaminating the Earth, and that it had exploded or the amount of it had hugely increased over the time from the Industrial Revolution, but then also from the time that cars began using leaded gasoline. Yeah. And so he understood that it was everywhere in the environment. And then a doctor named Herb Needleman was the one who led the work on understanding what lead might be doing to children's bodies at a lower level, at a subclinical level. So for a long time, people have known that lead is toxic for thousands of years. And if you get acute lead poisoning, you can have seizures and blindness and you can die. That's an obvious problem. Everybody recognized that. And even the businesses who created lead products recognize that. But understanding, we managed to avoid some of that, to get rid of the worst of those kinds of cases. It's very rare for someone to have that kind of extreme lead poisoning today. But the problem is that now we understand that there is no safe level of lead in the body, and especially in children's bodies as they're developing and their brains are developing. And then lead gets in there and it kind of makes everything go a little bit haywire in children's cells and brain. And so Herb Needleman was one of the first. These two were not the only people, but they were among those, and they were at the forefront, and they were the most attacked by industry. Both of them were charged with all kinds of, Needleman got called up on charges of professional misconduct, mostly at the behest of the lead industry. And so they really had to fight both for their findings and for their reputations.
Yes.
But they were willing to do that. And that is where change comes from, I think, right? And the rest of the scientific world, the knowledge coalesced around them, I guess you could say. And what happens there is epidemiology, where you try to understand, what's causing something in people. It's not an exact science, but if you get the same kinds of information from animal studies that lead is harmful, and from environmental studies showing that there's all this lead in more lead where next to the road. You were mentioning, taking that near schools, we need to avoid idling engines and things like that. If you can see that there's higher lead and that those kids in those schools have higher levels of lead in their bodies and all kinds of things, you can start to draw real conclusions. And that is what has happened. And obviously we've seen here in this country. My book actually tells a pretty happy tale of this success, because getting lead out of gasoline and paint and all these things was one of the great public health stories of the 20th century. But unfortunately, we didn't finish the job, and there is still lead in pipes, and as we've seen here in Flint, Michigan in the last few years, and as you're seeing, and now people are understanding that, we needed, because the cost of getting this last bit out is a lot out of old pipes and old houses and things like that. So anyway, the thing is, though, there are people who say we shouldn't change anything until we are absolutely certain of the risk, and there's other people who say we can't put things out in the world until we are absolutely certain of the safety. And so It depends a bit on what your perspective is.
Yes, it's interesting. And I think part of the problem here is the natural resilience of the environment, isn't it? Because we're so used to the world we live in bouncing back, and we don't really. The thing is, what happens after the course of time? We just assume it's always going to be okay.
Right, and that was way back in the 20th century. The industry scientists who were leading, they were the leading figures leading authorities on the effects of lead in the early and mid 20th century, and they said, it goes out of your car's tailpipe and it just dissipates and goes away. And, that's it. But what Patterson, the geochemist I mentioned, proved was that is not it at all. It stays here, in the oceans and in the soil, and and it doesn't. You cannot do that forever. You just can't. There are long-term consequences. And that is, and I think, resilience is about preparing. It's about understanding what those long-term consequences will be and being smart enough to prepare now for what's coming and not just reacting on a short-term basis. There's no problem today, even though, in fact, often there is a problem today. But, And
that's the problem, isn't it? It's about building capacity in the system to be able to bounce back in the first place. And,
exactly.
That's it. We very rarely fix the roof in the good times because we're actually too busy enjoying the good times. And then we're quite good in a crisis when there seems to be things right in front of us, which is great when you can fix something in 5 minutes. But the lead thing obviously has taken years and years to actually, as you say, and it's still not finished.
Years.
Yeah.
Right. That's exactly right. And so, but that is something, we know what the solutions are. We know that, if you don't expose children to lead, they will be healthier, and we know how to do that. It's just that it costs a lot of money and it's disruptive. There are, of course, things that happen to us, like my son turning out to be deaf, that are completely unexpected, but there's a similarity in that, then what do you do? How do you react?
So tell me more about your son and his situation.
Well, he's 16 now. He's a great kid. And but I had never met a deaf child before I had my own son. And so, well, I guess I would say that my approach to the world is a little bit founded on my father had he had a phrase called recovery technique that I think you would appreciate, which is his way of describing what you talk about when you talk about resilience, and what a lot of us think about is that, life is not just what happens to you. In fact, sometimes it's not really most importantly about what happens to you, but it's about what you do next.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Right? How you move forward, how you respond. And so when I discovered that my son couldn't hear very well, there's a bit of a story about it took a while to get clear answers about exactly what was going on with him, and that in some ways complicated it, but also it meant that by the time he was clearly identified as having at the beginning he had a moderate to profound loss in both ears. Now he's profoundly deaf in one and has a severe to profound loss in the other. But it actually, to tell you the truth, it came as something of a relief because it was an answer.
Yes,
right? And once you have an answer, then you can act.
Absolutely.
And then you can do things. I mean, it was also, though, it required, in the story of my own life, I put the discovery of Alex's hearing problems as a traumatic experience. And people in the deaf culture will lambaste me for that, but I'm talking about how I experienced it, and what it did is the same thing as the other sort of traumas I've had to go through in my life. It just upended everything in our lives and how we thought life was going to go, and what we knew about how to raise a kid, how to help him, how to what would a happy, successful life look like? And it's entirely possible to have a happy and successful life as deaf people. Most people do.
Yeah.
But I just didn't know it. I wasn't familiar with that world. And as I said, I didn't know any individuals, or the ones I did know were my parents' age with a hearing aid. Actually, the great irony is that most of my parents' friends were resisting getting hearing aids until they met my son with his equipment and saw how well it worked for him. And they said, well, if Alex can do it, I should be out there getting a hearing aid too. So that was kind of fun that he had a positive effect on his elders, you could say.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say what you say, because I don't think people, people, if they don't come across a disability, why would they expect to be able to cope with it? Why wouldn't you be knocked off track a little bit? Why wouldn't you think to yourself, oh goodness, how do I do this? Because how would you know? And actually, I think part of the problem with some of these things is this idea that people judge you or lambast you for not knowing. Well, how could you have known?
Exactly. And one of the things I set out to do in my book, which was I wrote several years later, I was already a reporter and a science writer. I'd already written the environmental book about lead. And so my natural coping mechanism was to just start researching. And I had the great luxury of feeling that I could call people up. I was used to calling scientists and experts up and asking them questions and finding things on the internet. The internet can be a help and it can be a horrible thing, right? If you're in a crisis like this. But anyway, I just started researching, and I didn't realize. Now I realized that I was writing my book from the get-go, but I didn't know that for the first few years. And so I was really just trying to learn everything I could learn so that I could understand and I could try to help him. But then a few years in, and when I did decide to write about the experience, and I was mostly interested in it as a science story, both as a memoir, but also as a science story, I thought I was uniquely positioned, since I was both in the scientific world and the mother of a child with a cochlear implant. I was I had this front row seat to very cutting edge science. And cochlear implants are the first time that we have taken technology and have been able, in fact, to reverse a major disability. Now, let me say, a cochlear implant does not make you a hearing person.
Right.
It's the equivalent then of becoming more hard of hearing in the world. But it allows my son to operate in the hearing world in an astonishingly fluid way. And so anyway, but the thing is that then I also wanted to understand why there was such resistance in the deaf community to this technology, and a big part of the reason is that they're upset by the scientific approach to deafness, or the medicalization of it.
Yes.
The idea that it is a problem to be fixed. They think it's they see it as a difference, and I worked really hard to understand that and to understand where they were coming from, and that's one of the threads in my book, is to sort of explore deaf cultural history, and as a hearing parent to sort of be honest about how I felt being dropped in the middle of this. And I'm used to thinking of myself as a extremely liberal, tolerant person, and it was hard to be on the other side. And I've had people say that I've abused my child for putting a cochlear implant in him, but I don't agree. And I think the science is unequivocal. If you want a child to get spoken language fluently, and then that leads to reading, then they need that sound in the brain in the very early years of life.
Yes. Well, there's evidence in terms of neuroplasticity that the brain screens out irrelevant things, or things that it's not able to do or doesn't want. So your ability to learn many languages is sort of prized down, isn't it? And so
Yes.
if you're not hearing sound, one imagines that your capacity to understand the way sound works, and I suppose the use of language could be compromised as well, could it?
Oh, it is. It absolutely is. And now it's so language is compromised, but so is reading, because reading
Right.
in the brain builds on the
In a voice.
language networks that get laid down first. And now it's important to point out that if you have exposure to sign language from the get-go, from a native fluent speaker, then those language networks also get laid down, and that works as a foundation. But the problem is that the vast majority, more than 90% of kids who are deaf and hard of hearing, are born to hearing parents who don't sign. And you can learn to sign, and I did learn some signing, but it's never going to be the same as speaking fluently in your native tongue to your child and teaching them language that
It's
way.
a new language.
So that's the basic problem there.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, interesting. So, and I suppose the cochlear implant thing is fascinating, because there are examples of people who have been profoundly deaf all of their lives rejecting them, haven't they? And almost preferring, because of the cacophony and chaos.
They do, and that is their choice. And
course, yeah.
It's also true that if you've been deaf all your life and then you got a cochlear implant, it will change some things, but it will never have the same effect as it had for a young child like my son. It allows you access to some sound, but it doesn't really give you that boost in language and things like that it can give a child. But yeah, people, as I said, people live wonderful, fulfilling, happy lives in the deaf world signing, and that's it's actually a beautiful culture and community and language, and I am actually very supportive of it, except when they tell me that I can't make choices for my own child.
Yes, that's the thing about being a parent, though, isn't it? I mean,
yes.
That's a different thing altogether. It's all very well represented in the community,
exactly.
But you're still a mom, aren't you? So that's part of it. Yes, interesting. I was going to ask you an extremely insightful and penetrating question there that dropped out of my head. So sorry
I'm
about
glad that
that.
happens to you too. That happens to me all the time.
And I suppose he'll have a choice when he's ready. I know what I was going to ask you. Maybe not that great question, but a different one. Who did you write the book for? Was it some people write books for themselves, and some people write them for a community? Maybe the heart of I don't know what the precise phrase is. People who are deaf, or did you write it for parents of deaf children? What was your thinking when you began this book?
I hoped it is certainly a book, and its most fervent audience is parents, and also teachers and audiologists who work in the deaf community with kids who use technology to hear and then to speak and listen. But I hoped and to some extent have been gratified to see that the book has also reached a larger audience of people who first of all, it's a brain development story in children. It's a really important sort of. I hoped that people would better understand and not take for granted what goes on in the brain of kids who are hearing, because then I came to understand just how important all that was. And he's my youngest of three, so I had been down this road. I'd had two other kids learn to speak and to read, and yet as a professional and well-educated person, there was so much I didn't know. So part of it is the brain development story, which is for a wider audience. And I also did want a wider audience to understand more about what the discussion in the deaf world about this technology, because again, I think it's a question that's like lead is a case study. This is about identity and technology and science and medicine and how we approach these questions. And people are going to come down on different sides, and all I could do was kind of tell my story and my thinking, but also present the science. And I was very proud that a lot of people felt that my account of deaf culture in the signing world was very sympathetic and fair and balanced. But I do feel very strongly that cochlear implants are one of the great inventions of our time. And they have fundamentally changed my life and my son's life. And I wanted people to know about that. But there's quite a division. I mean, I think it's better now, but there was the signing deaf versus the oral deaf. And it felt like there was no bridge. And I hoped to be a little bit of a bridge, but that's not so easy to pull off.
And it's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, we get back to resilience. I mean, one of the reasons humans are resilient is that we're able to adapt to our world around us through the use of tools. And
yes.
And in a sense, this is just a tool, isn't it? And you can get stuck on the ethical, moral, and sociological problems. But at the most fundamental level, that's what it is.
That's exactly right. It is a tool, and it doesn't make my son a hearing person. He's a deaf person who uses this tool to access sound. Yeah. And that's a different, and hearing people do sometimes, this is the thing of where you talked about complexity earlier, and how it's not like you just flip a switch and it's this miraculous thing, even though it is pretty miraculous, because getting the sound into the brain and having it make sense was quite a scientific feat, and it took a whole lot of time and effort, but they got there in the end. And so, but yes, it's amazing to me how brain plasticity is a story of resilience in itself, and that's what I spend most of my time writing about, and is how my son's brain adapted to what his version of the world was. And then because he uses a cochlear implant in one ear and a hearing aid in the other, he actually gets different kinds of sound from those two things, but it's all he's ever known, and it's how he learned to talk. And so it works for him. His brain works with that,
That's absolutely fascinating, isn't it? And it's something it's tricky when you have all of your senses, I suppose, to understand losing one. I think there's a guy called David Eagleman, who I'm sure you've come across in terms of neuroscience research, and he talks about the Umwelt, which is this sort of worldview, like dogs as Umwelt, as their sense of smell. And actually, as human beings, we sort of tend to balance visual, auditory cues more, I think. So to lose hearing must be... You can't imagine it. But I suppose if you've always had a lack of hearing, your son, in a sense, I wonder if he misses what he didn't know he ever had. If that makes sense.
No, right. Well, he cannot experience the world any way other than he has. Exactly. But the thing I was going to say, though, is that the thing about deafness that was so important to understand is that for centuries we treated deaf people terribly, and they had no way of communicating. They were shut off in a way that now blind people have a lot of trouble with mobility, but they can communicate. They can talk to people. And so everyone thought that deaf people were mentally challenged. They were stupid. They were uneducable, all those things. None of that is true at all. But sign languages were this, were sort of, they were homemade, I guess you could say, in way back. And then it began in France a couple hundred years ago to become something different. And I mean, interestingly, one of the reasons cochlear implants were such a touch point, such a controversial development, was that they came along. It was a perfect storm. They came along in the world right as the deaf movement, the deaf civil rights movement, was sort of flowering and flourishing, and ASL, American Sign Language here, but I'm also in Britain and everywhere else. And every country has its own sign language, by the way. I'm not sure people always know that. Often they don't. But sign language was being given the respect it deserved as an actual language. And so that was all happening. And then cochlear implants were coming along in this and suddenly changing what was possible technology-wise, but not everybody, people didn't think it would work. That was one problem. It was yet another medicalized solution. Yeah. But the thing is, it does work. So that's the takeaway in the end but it does work.
And I mean, without being too glib about it, I mean, in order to have great relationships and friendships, sound and hearing is so important. And I'm interested to know how you went into a book about friendship as your next subject.
Yes, well, I was covered. So by that second book, I Can Hear You Whisper, really did take me into covering the brain, and I got really fascinated by brain, neuroscience, psychology, things like that. And so after I finished that book, I was casting around what did I want to do next, in addition to my freelance writing. And I got interested in a field called social neuroscience, which is a relatively new field, and it is really looking at the social aspects of how we interact in the brain and the physiology of our interactions with other people. And I just found it fascinating. And then kind of while I was sitting there one day at a conference listening to this stuff, I thought, I was at that moment where at that point my kids were teenagers and beginning to go off to college. And my mother, unfortunately, suffers from Alzheimer's disease. I'd already lost my father. And I was, I have a wonderful husband, but I thought, oh boy, I better get on it and make sure I'm spending time with my friends. It was as simple as that, because, my life was changing and who was in it and who was in my inner circle. And I've always had good friends, but I was interested. Friendship is getting really newfound respect in the scientific world, and the kinds of scientists like neuroscientists and evolutionary biologists who didn't ever used to study it now study it. Yes. And now they even can kind of say, yes, we study this, and they can hold their heads up high and not be embarrassed about it. And there was a time where there was an article maybe 20 years ago that somebody published in a scientific journal called, using the F word of primatology, and she meant friendship, right? Exactly. So, can we talk about this as a serious scientific subject? But what is true from a resiliency point of view is that, friends, it's the most important. I think it's a template for all other relationships, because what they have found now is that and it's across species, which is how we know it's evolutionary. But so in baboons and rhesus macaques and in people, those with the strongest bonds live the longest. And in the animal world, in the monkeys and apes, they have more reproductive success, which is a fundamental measure of evolution, of natural selection. And so it's the strongest bonds, and baboons and macaques tend to hang out with family. But when they don't have family nearby, they work to build relationships with non-relatives. And it's kind of the exception proves the rule, that you need to have a core group of individuals that you can count on in a crisis. And
it's the foundation of community, isn't it?
It's the foundation of community. And it's not to say that we are, it's not, I worry sometimes that people will think that I'm being very mercenary about friendship, but it's so much deeper than that. It's the reason we do it is so that we have these bonds that we can call on when we need them. But you wouldn't enjoy all the time you spend with your friends building up to that moment if it wasn't rewarding. And the brain rewards us for things that it wants us to repeat. Now, sometimes that doesn't work out with addiction and things like that. But with friendship, it's the critical. It's why it's fun. to hang out with your friends.
And we all get it, don't we? Because actually some of us have had friends for life and partners for months. And,
yes.
And you often find some of your best friends are with you. I mean, it's great if your partner's your best friend and all that sort of stuff, but often not. And I think I think sometimes the pruning of friendship in a relationship is one of the most dangerous signs about the negative aspect of the power play within a relationship.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because that's when I said that I think of friendship as a template for relationships. I'm talking about the strongest friendships are, if you think about the people the friends you're closest to, those relationships, if you strip them down to the simplest things, and they are positive, they make you feel good, right? They're usually very long lasting, or there's stability in them, and there's some reciprocity or cooperativeness in there. So it's, even if you help out for a while, then someday your friend will return the favor. And sometimes it's as simple as, I had you for dinner, now you have me. And then sometimes it's you've lost your mother, or you're in a crisis with your child, and I'm here for you. And that template, when we call our spouse or our romantic significant other or a sibling a friend, we do it to signal something about the quality of the relationship, right? Just saying husband or wife or boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever it is doesn't actually tell me anything about the quality of the relationship. I hope it's good, but it might not be, right? Whereas if you say that this person is my best friend, I know something about the quality of that relationship. And what they have found is that the quality of relationships is the most important thing in terms of giving you that resilience that you need and getting you for your health. Literally, it shapes your biology and affects how long you're going to be on this planet.
And isn't it interesting how, as a concept, it's something we all get, we all treasure, we all understand. There's very little real research into it, so I'm really pleased you've done this. And
well, there is actually now. That's the thing, though. I'll just say, I don't want to cut you off, but we think we understand it. But there's so much more that we don't. So that's what my book is, to show you all that you didn't realize that you didn't know about friendship. But anyway, what were you going to say?
No, I was going to say this. What I find interesting is the fact that we get it right across the generations. So you'll hear kids talking about BFFs. And they get that, don't they? And
yes.
And it doesn't matter what age you are, this concept of friendships. And my point was, I suppose to say, we've spent too much time talking about relationships as a sort of research area rather than friendships. So really, you might have heard a little bit of clicking. That was me joining your mailing list, because I know this.
Oh, excellent!
I know this book isn't ready to release yet. So tell me. So let's go through some of the books. Let's go from start to finish. So the friendship book. When is that coming out?
So it will be out in the U.S. on January 28th, 2020, and it will be out in the U.K. I believe in March. Right now they're saying March 18th or 19th, but. So I think that will be around then.
So you already have one sale, because I've just put myself down for that. So that's good, isn't it?
Beautiful. Thank you. I love that.
And where can we find I Can Hear You Whisper and Toxic Truth?
On Amazon, wherever books are sold, basically. Well, that's not entirely true in the UK, but on Amazon and the other online retailers, you could find it, and both of them. And yes, you can keep up with my work on my website, lydiadenworth.com. I have a newsletter that goes out only about once a month, and I promise it's full of really interesting work and the things that I'm doing. A little behind the scenes, reporter's notebook stuff sometimes too.
Excellent. And you've got a very fascinating blog as well, I have to say. So I have been shopping through your blog earlier as well. Some really interesting...
Yes, I write a blog for Psychology Today. I should have mentioned that. It's called Brainwaves, and I pretty much get to write about whatever interests me. I write a lot about new neuroscience, but I also write about friendship and connection and the science and biology of it.
Yeah, you and I are writing about very similar things, so we must talk about that later on, but after this podcast. So Lydia, it's been an absolute joy to talk to you. Thank you so much. And let me just confirm that for everybody. LydiaDenworth.com is the website, and Amazon has all of those books. And I'm certainly looking forward to that friendship book. So thank you for spending time with us today, Lydia.
Thank you so much.
You take care.
You too.
Thanks for listening today. You can go to our site qedod.com/podcasts and subscribe to hear other titles in our series. Or you can contact us at info@qedod.com to hear and find out more about tough love, leadership, accountability, resilience and burnout. You can go to our site qedod.com/burnout2019 to hear and get access to a load of resources to help you manage and fight burnout. And you can go to qedod.com/free ebook to hear more about the fundamentals of resilience. Until the next episode, keep on thriving.